I'd like to come back in a moment to beats because I think that's one of the most important things I've learned from you, and it's helped me as a writer. But before we go to that, I'd like to ask you about how the dialogue changes from the prose uh, to uh, to the comic to the panel. Um, I mean, and where does the change occur if indeed a change occurs? And it seems to me that in most prose, there's extensive dialogue, compound sentences, and a number of other things that don't fit into comic dialogue. And I just wondered how you get that across and how you get the meaning across from the writer to the cartoonist in your
It's an
case.
interesting question, Bill. The form of comics has a lot of constraints, so that is an interesting thing, as you know. Being a prose writer, you need to adapt to those constraints, and one of the constraints are the size of the page, the size of the possible panels, the size of the possible caption box, the size of the possible dialogue balloons within a panel. So yes, you're absolutely right. The dialogue has to be edited down, and it has to serve. As a writer, you need to know exactly what purpose each line of dialogue is serving in moving the story forward.
Do you find that when you're teaching your students that type of process actually improves the prose dialogue in the story too, or is that something you may not observe? I mean, especially if the prose is just being created for the comics. But I'm wondering if there isn't an advantage for writers to go through this process to create their
Yeah,
prose
I
dialogue
would
more
say,
effectively.
I mean, one of the first things that new writers to comics learn is that, you know, so much of the job of the pictures can take the place of a lot of verbiage that might otherwise be in a prose story, and that you use the dialogue to advance the story, to increase tension, to establish character, and all of those things. But you find that you can strip down a lot of that dialogue because you have the advantage of having pictures which can include, you know, facial expressions, posture, relationships of characters to another in the frame, all of those kinds of things, you know, many of which come from the world of film, also from theater, different ways that you can establish relationships between characters and the scene in general through placement of objects, including the characters in relation to it.
Yeah, I'm also interested in along the same vein in perspective. And I'm particularly asking this question to benefit writers because writers think in terms of point of view and voice and a number of other aspects of in perspective in general, third person or first person, but they also have to think and usually don't think a whole lot about exactly how the reader is perceiving a scene as such. And when it goes to comics, I mean, you've got a narrator point of view, but sometimes you're visualizing that scene through a character's eyes. It seems to me, sometimes through a dog's eye or something that is creative and really adds to those. How does I guess, Sari, how do you think of it, of the perspective? Do you think of it when you're writing your script and when you're giving it to them? Do you say narrator perspective, or this caption is going to be author related and a world perspective? How do you do that? And then how much does that affect you, Josh, when you when you go to draw your perspectives, are you thinking about that ahead of time, or is it panel by panel, and are you just working in an incremental form?
Interesting questions, Bill. Well, I think in comics, we generally use the terms point of view, not perspective. But of course, we are dealing in the same terrain. The idea of perspective in fiction is a perhaps broader concept, but it's communicated in comics through all of those point of view choices. All of those point of view choices that you make.
Stand by. Bill dropped for a second. We will get him back in.
A little more.
Yeah.
Welcome to live internet. Here he is. He's coming back to the room, so we will catch the ball and get him back online. Apologize for the interruption.
We missed you, Bill.
Oh, it's good to be back.
Welcome back. Welcome back, sir.
I'm so glad I missed you. Here I am. And after that long, complicated question, I'm sure you've forgotten any try at an answer to that. But we were talking about perspective.
Yeah, I hope most of what Sari was talking about came through. But I think again there are constraints within comics, but then there are also many powers that comics have. I think comics have this ability to portray, to really bring a character, the reader into a scene in a really powerful and intimate way, to really bring action to life and to tell stories through dialogue and action. However you define action, it can be exploding planets, or it can just be two people talking with a lot of drama in a room. But the one thing that you do think about regarding point of view is that you can overdo it. You were talking about being able to tell a story from the perspective of a dog, or every different character in the room, and an omniscient narrator. And with great power comes great responsibility, as Spider-Man once said. So what's most important is to serve the story, and if the story requires that you have a limited point of view, and that you don't switch it around too much, because that can be very jarring or disorienting for a reader, or take away from the thrust of the narrative, then you as the cartoonist have to restrain that impulse. And that's, I think, where a seasoned cartoonist can be helpful to a new writer, especially in sort of guiding them into ways that hopefully help that initial spark, that idea of the writer, to be told in the best possible way through comics.
I have one more thing to add to that. Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Listening to Josh, I was just thinking that in some ways, maybe the prose writer, the fiction writer, has an advantage when in working in comics, because, as you know, Bill, when you set out to write a story or a novel, you have to make a lot of choices at the outset about point of view. So are you going to be writing in first person or third person? Is it going to be limited? Is it going to be broader? Are we going to seek to combine them in very effective ways, like James Wood talks about in The Art of Fiction, and I always strive to do in my own work? But there's choices that have to be made kind of up front, and that I think helps in some ways, because comics does offer such a variety of choices all the way through. You can always do that, even in the middle of a story. Probably it wouldn't serve the story, but it might. So I think that in that way, maybe prose writers have an advantage getting into
Yeah, just one more thing to add to that. There's a very famous one sheet of comics tips that a cartoonist named Wally Wood made back in the 60s, I think, called 22 Panels That Always Work, and they've been photocopied and distributed all around the comics community for years, and they're basically a primer for artists on different ways to frame shots, in all these different ways to make a scene more dynamic. And, whether having characters in silhouette or having someone in extreme foreground and someone in the background, or a bird's eye shot or a worm's eye view, and all of these different ways to pump up a scene. But I used to keep that on my drawing table because I thought I could always use that, And I was speaking to a cartoonist later on in life, telling Chris Ware is his name. He's a great cartoonist for those of you who aren't familiar with his work. And I said, oh, well, what about, the 22 panels that always work? And he's like, yeah, but those 22 panels, that thing is for, it has nothing to do with the story that's being told. I mean, that's great that you have that power to use all those different tricks to liven a scene. But if the scene needs to be quiet, if it needs to be intimate, you can't do that because you're totally undercutting the story. And when he said that, it sort of, it really clicked for me. Like, you need to think of the story, the whole narrative, what the writer intends more than anything else.
And when I was thinking about this question too, I was thinking about Chris Ware because he's such an interesting study, because he sets up a lot of constraints for himself from the outset that he then has to work within, in the same way that perhaps a prize writer